We're joined by Maciej Nowicki, president of the Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining me in the studio.
Thank you for having me tonight.
So, I read this quote in Politico earlier today. If there is one thing that we've learned from 2015 is that the European countries' attitude to protection seekers can shift rapidly. As the EU parliamentary elections are nearing, and we know that they're actually taking place this very moment as well, we have different sides of the political spectrum sort of changing their tune on the migration policy. Why do you think this shift happened?
Well, I don't think that this actually, these very elections will mark another very significant shift, because I do believe that actually the shift has happened already and is still happening, and is not.
So it's a continuous process.
It's a process, and it's not really very well reflected in the public debate ongoing. And
I'm happy you're here to clear this up for us.
And also, not when you read manifestos, programmatic statements of the main political groupings in the EU Parliament, you also...
Let's refrain from too many details.
Okay.
The electoral period.
So I believe that actually the main discussion about migration is very vocal, and it attracts a lot of attention, but it's far from the practice of many also member states of the European Union. And to be concrete, I think that the main challenge now is about externalization of the borders and those return agreements with the countries of transit, or another safe country, so not the countries of origin, actually. And this is not very much discussed. The left-wing spectrum is, side of the spectrum is against such kind of deals, but actually, and also against pushbacks, but actually there are no other clear propositions on the table that could stop pushbacks that are unfortunately common practice on all external borders of the EU.
So as you mentioned before, there is this continuous process that we're looking at. And we are looking, I suppose that you partially also referred to the new pact on immigration and asylum, something that's been introduced earlier this year. However, we had 15 member states actually calling for tougher measures. Do you think this pact actually needs rebooting, and why?
I do think that it did not solve many problems. It was attacked from the left and the right. And if you listen to the politicians at the capitals, European capitals, it's really difficult to believe that there is a political will of fulfilling actually the pact and making it a living instrument. So it's rather clear that the discussion is still ongoing. And for example, some of the important groups call for a new migration, not pact, but code, or reforms of the common asylum system. So, in fact, the pact is really probably not that important in the practice, and will not resolve any major challenges.
Do you think after this election the EU is actually going to put more emphasis on getting its borders and its member states ready for possible new waves of migration? Because as we know, the situation is very dynamic here in Europe, in the Middle East. We know that some of the countries are also dealing with migration coming from Africa. So there are many moving pieces.
Yeah, I would say that in practice, again, not in the public discourse, there are four main features of the situation and the policies now in place of the member states rather than the EU as a whole. So this is response to instrumentalization of migration, so this kind of a hybrid war that we have on the border with Belarus. There is externalization that I've already mentioned, but clearly the first feature, very clear, is militarization actually and securitization. And if we see at the polls, at the European Eurobarometer, we see that for the voters, actually migration is not the top priority anymore, as it used to be last year. Security is one, but it's also not the first priority. But having said that, I think that especially here in Finland, in Baltic states and in Poland, we'll deal with militarization with all of the challenges that come with it, also challenges to human rights, of course.
I would like to take this moment because in light of what happened on the Polish-Belarusian border in recent days and the very tragic and unfortunate passing of one of the Polish border guards, there is the topic is clearly on the rise. So it seems to be the case that Lukashenko's regime is weaponizing migrants as well. What steps do you think that the EU should take to protect its borders? However, keeping in mind that these are still people that are being used by a state such as Belarus.
Yeah, it's a crucial question for us. It's super difficult actually to answer it sensibly. Of course, we say that there is a law that cannot be flouted, the European law for sure, which is very much violated at the moment. And we cannot forget that these are people seeking refuge, and part of them are really migrants, part of them are people who are entitled to international protection, who are seeking protection against persecution. So pushbacks, for sure, is not the answer. They are not only illegal, but they are also unsafe, because then in the situation of pushback, the migrants are not registered and they very likely will come back again, because there are those pushbacks and ping-pong pushbacks happening all the time. So we never know who those people who are on our territory are if they're not registered and if their applications are not processed. So I believe that still the question of security is absolutely at most important, but especially having a closed zone without access of humanitarian aid and without access of monitors of media and NGOs is actually going only to worsen the situation.
You mentioned a very important subject, the element of the hybrid warfare, which is obviously what we're trying to protect the European Union and the member states from. How do we know? How can we tell? What kind of measures do we introduce to know that the migrants that could possibly be seeking asylum, or asylum seekers, so to speak, are actually not being sent to harm the inner structures of the European Union?
Well, of course, they are sent or used actually by the regime, actually both regimes, Russian and Belarusian.
But there is a clear distinction, because there are obviously people who are looking to have a better life, they're looking for a better future for their families, and there could be potentially people that could be working with foreign agents, foreign states, in order to mingle. For example, like it was the case with the EU parliamentary elections. So how do we distinguish? How do we navigate?
Yeah, it is a tough issue, of course, but all the more if we don't register them, we just push them to Belarus and they come back. And many of them, of course, go then to Germany or stay in Poland unregistered. We completely don't know who they are. So we as a country, as a state, are deprived of possibility of any kind of checking. Our services cannot work on this. So I believe that this is also, as I've said, a security issue. But generally speaking, of course, there is a lot of practice in processing applications for asylum, for example, and determining who is entitled to protection and who is a migrant who is just seeking a good life. Justice, maybe not a good word, because everybody can seek a good life, but there is, of course, a clear legal and ethical difference between those two. And if there are agents, probably, or people who are sent to harm, of course, there is a threat. There is a threat as well.
I would like us to take a moment to hear a soundbite from the Commander-in-Chief of the Polish police force, who had some things to say about the recent events and the passing of this young man. So let's take a moment to hear that very soundbite.
I am here with the state prosecutor to stress that the actions of the Polish state are guided by the rule of law. I fully support our police officers and will always support them when they repel attacks. The prosecutor is here also to get this message across to the officers, that if the situation in which firearms were used is ambiguous, in every case the current circumstances, that is the recent rise of aggressive border-crossing attempts, will be taken into consideration. The police have firearms. Depending on the circumstances, the squad commander makes the decision to directly transfer weapons to officers. Due to the recent escalation, as of yesterday, police officers have personal weapons on them.
So we just heard from the Commander-in-Chief of the Polish police force. Last but not least, a very important question. There was a 21-year-old man who was serving on the border, and unfortunately he passed due to an attack from a migrant coming from the Belarusian side. What's your opinion? Do you think that soldiers should be allowed more freedom in order to protect themselves in such cases, especially when we're dealing with such a delicate subject?
They should be, of course, well-equipped and well-trained, actually, so all the measures for their safety and for the safety of other officers who are there should be taken. But on the other hand, we have to take into account that they are dealing with civilians. If they are dealing with attacks, which are like sometimes very brutal...
In this case, they're dealing with armed civilians, because there is a dead man out there.
Yeah, of course.
And there is a family grieving, so we
course.
have to remember about that as well.
Of course, I do remember, and I think it's really like a huge tragedy, of course. But we still have to remember that those kinds of appeals that there should be more freedom in using deadly weapons can be really very deadly and detrimental, and can also escalate the situation, which is also from the geopolitical point of view something that has to be taken with consideration.
Thank you so much. It's incredibly important to have this discussion, and I suppose that after the EU parliamentary elections, we will be finding out more about how this EU migration policy could possibly change and develop. Maciej Nowicki, thank you so much for joining us in the studio.